On January 24, 2022, a terrified 43-year-old woman rushed into a police station in El Alto, Bolivia. She was out of breath, traumatized, and lucky to be alive. She told officers she had been contacted on social media for a job offer, a standard procedure for many. But when she arrived at the location, the job was a trap. She described a man who didn't just want to hire her, he wanted to own her. He had beaten her, extorted her, and held her against her will. But in a moment of sheer desperation, she managed to escape his grip. Her statement didn't just close a single assault case. It pulled a loose thread that unraveled one of the darkest criminal scandals in South American history. The police raided the home of the man she identified. His name was Richard Choque Flores. What they found inside his home, and buried underneath it, would shock the world. This is the story of a man believed to have over 70 victims. A man who hunted women with the help of his own family, and a justice system that let a monster walk free. Richard Chuck Flores was born on November 9, 1988, in the city of El Alto, in the Pedro Domingo Murillo province of the La Paz department in Bolivia. As a child, he lived with his father, a policeman, his mother, a teacher, and his sister. He had a very ordinary childhood. Often, he could be seen coming and going in the company of his mother. Especially his mother appeared to them as an unfriendly person with whom they preferred not to speak anymore. When Richard was just 4 years old, his father was killed at work, and the family lost an important person. The trauma of his father's death began to manifest in the boy's strange behavior, which his mother could not control. Richard had practically no friends, and on weekends he sometimes visited one of his paternal cousins. The young man was named Fidel and was several years younger than him. When Richard spent time with Fidel, everything seemed to go smoothly. As a teenager, he attended a military academy, but did not stay there long. It is not known why he decided to drop out of his studies. When he returned to his family's home, where he lived with his mother and sister under one roof, Richard showed some strange personality traits behind closed doors. But this had not yet worried anyone outside his family. At least until his cousin Fidel said he also wanted to study at a military academy. This turned out to be an opportunity for Richard, who had little experience in this field, to help him with the application. The young man promised his aunt and cousin that he would take care of the physical preparation so that Fidel could go to college smoothly, and that he would also prepare the necessary documents for this purpose. His aunt gave him the sum of $5,000 to cover his tuition and expenses. On May 19, 2011, Fidel said goodbye to his mother and left his home with great enthusiasm to fulfill his dream. He met his cousin Richard in El Alto to travel together to Cochabamba, where the college was located. This was the last day Fidel and his mother spoke. Richard took the receiver and told her, at the urging of his aunt, who asked for a conversation with her son, that Fidel was learning parachuting in Haiti and that he was doing well. He used this occasion to ask her to send him money and computer equipment so that Fidel could continue his studies. This whole situation was extremely suspicious, but the concern grew when Richard Choque Flores' face appeared in the national media in connection with the terrible crime he was accused of. On the afternoon of November 22, 2013, a girl named Blanca Ruy Lima went to the State University in El Alto, where she had been studying for the past 2 years, as she had done every day. But on that day, Blanca did not return home. No one had any idea of her whereabouts until her mother, Nancy, received the worst news she could have expected. The next day, from Blanca's mobile phone came the message that her daughter had been kidnapped and that she would have to pay a ransom of $20,000 for her return. Moreover, the criminal warned her that he would kill her daughter if she informed the police. Nancy was desperate because it was impossible to raise such a sum. As she could not bear the pain of losing her daughter and wanted to give up, she turned to the Special Unit for Crime Fighting for help and began an intensive search for the girl. The authorities found out that Blanca had been contacted via social networks by a man named Mauricio Tran, who claimed to be an instructor at a military academy. He convinced her to meet him to offer his help with her application for a study program. The search operation lasted about 9 days until the authorities, in collaboration with Nancy, implemented their plan. They told the kidnapper that they had left money in a hiding place on the street to save Blanca. When the man appeared at the spot where he thought the $220,000 would be, the police arrested him. It turned out that he had faked his real identity. It turned out to be the 25-year-old Richard Chalk Flores. The investigators wasted no time and searched the house where the young man lived. When they arrived, their hope of finding Blanca alive was shattered. On November 29th, the girl's body was found buried in a blue jay sack in a grave in the house. They also found several other women's IDs and even underwear. Because of these discoveries and the murder of Blanca, Richard Chalk was sent to prison, where he awaited his trial, which would lead to a conviction. Based on the results of the autopsy of Blanca's body, it was determined that the girl had died of suffocation and had been hit on the head with an object that caused a skull injury. But to make matters worse, she had been brutally attacked by her assailant before she died. After this brutal crime, Richard Ch. Flores was sentenced to the maximum penalty of life imprisonment, which meant that he would have to spend 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole or house arrest. When his aunt, Fidel's mother, learned on television of the crime her nephew had committed, her doubts and suspicions regarding her son's absence grew. She began to visit him in prison, pleading with him to tell her where Fidel was, whom she had last seen in 2011. Faced with Richard's desperate silence, the woman decided to name him as a suspect in the young man's disappearance. However, instead of benefiting from this action, she only managed to provoke the anger of her nephew and his close relatives, who not only forbade her to visit him, but also followed her and threatened to kill her daughter, forcing the woman to leave the city and abandon the case for her own defense. In the meantime, Richard Chalk was sent to prison, where he was supposed to spend 30 years, which unfortunately did not happen. As Richard sat behind bars, the people of Bolivia, and especially the proud El Alto, were spared the pain that the premature loss of Blanca had left in their lives for several years. However, on May 17, 2021, the city was shocked again by another disappearance. The story involves a 17-year-old girl, Lucy Maya Ramirez, who left her home that day and was never heard from again. She had disappeared until her mother received a message the next day demanding a ransom of $7,000 for Lucy, or she would be killed if the payment was not made. Along with the terrible message, the girl's family received a series of explicit photos showing what would happen to her if they did not transfer the money. The family had no way of raising such an amount. The same incident happened again a few months later. It was August 27, 2021, when 15-year-old Iris M. Wilker did not return home. As in Lucy's case, the perpetrator demanded $7,000 to return her safe and sound. At the same time, the police continued to receive reports of women who had been victims of violence by a man who had deceived them with job promises via social networks, but the insatiable monster waiting for them on site had planned a completely different fate for them, until finally, in early 2022, one of the victims managed to unmask him. On January 24th, law enforcement authorities arrested one of Bolivia's most dangerous criminals, none other than Richard Chalk Flores, in a hotel. How could it happen that a criminal who was supposed to serve his sentence in prison was released and committed crimes again? The investigation that followed this case revealed the ineffectiveness and corruption of the justice system that should have ensured the safety of the victims, thereby arousing the anger of the population. The second arrest of Richard Chalk Flores sparked controversy, as police officers and healthcare workers were punished for complicity with the offender. A new investigation revealed that Richard, who had been in prison for only 6 years for the murder of young Blanca Rubilachi, was released on probation by a judge on December 24, 2019, even though he was not entitled to it. His lawyers found a way to change this situation. They did not choose a legal strategy, but the path of corruption. They unscrupulously argued that Richard Chalk Flores suffered from diseases that threatened his life in prison and that it would be better to keep him in a safe place. Dr. Freddie T. issued a false certificate to the defendant, diagnosing him with diseases and recommending a special medical treatment and diet to prevent stomach cancer. 3 days later, just before Christmas, Judge Rafael Alcon responded to the request of Richard Chach's lawyers, who, in addition to handing over a certificate, gave him $3,000 and a bottle of whiskey as a bribe to think about the matter. Thus, Richard Flores was prematurely released on December 24, 2019. He returned to the house he shared with his mother and sister in El Alto and managed to reoffend, which satisfied him greatly. From his probation until his second arrest, Richard inflicted harm on at least 77 girls, including sexual violence and murder. The way he did this highlighted the vulnerability of the security forces. Once Richard returned to his comfortable place, he unleashed his method to catch new victims. Although he sometimes changed the scenes and the identity he presented, he followed the same script in all cases, leading him to contact his victims. Richard created fake social media profiles in which he pretended to be a police officer or a woman named Hyde MZ. Sometimes he posted job ads. In these cases, he used the profile of High Mita, and thus gained the trust of other women. Richard exploited their financial vulnerability and posted an offer as an escort, stating that girls who wanted a good daily income in their spare time should write to him in private messages. The payment for services was hourly or daily. These posts were located in a group where people in the city of La Paz were looking for work. Other victims were invited by the alleged assistant to courier service jobs. But when they arrived at the place they had been called to, they were shocked to find that a trap had been set for them. Similarly, he behaved with his police profile by placing suspicious substances in the rooms where women stayed, which led Richard to meet them in uniform, making them believe he was a member of the crime-fighting unit. In all cases, he ordered his victims to record a video addressed to their relatives, asking them to give him a certain amount of money. If they did not comply, he forced them to have sex with him and threatened to send them to prison for possession of controlled substances. When investigators discovered his method, they immediately linked him to the disappearance of Iris and Lucy in 2021 and wasted no time investigating the case, prioritizing it in this direction. The authorities met with Richard Chaw to tell him the truth. Without resistance, the criminal admitted that he had indeed kidnapped and killed them. Security forces immediately went to his house, where a search was initiated, and the bodies of both girls were discovered. To everyone's surprise, they found something else. His cousin Fidel, who had been missing since 2011 and had also had the misfortune of falling into his clutches, was buried in his yard, as his aunt had suspected. As more than 70 complaints against him revealed, Richard Choc Flores was one of the most dangerous criminals in Bolivian history. Psychological and psychiatric examinations showed that Richard had the typical personality of an antisocial psychopath, lacking empathy and remorse, with a high rate of recidivism. These were characteristics that had been identified during his first arrest and that the judge ignored when he was released in 2019. Richard Choc Flores was sent back to prison and sentenced to the maximum penalty under Bolivian criminal law of 30 years for rape, extortion, and murder. As the investigation progressed and more truth came to light, the anger of the people grew when it became known that Richard's mother and sister were accomplices in covering up his crimes. The neighbors did not have to wait long. They went to the house where the women still lived and made their resistance to the family clear by painting graffiti on the walls and even setting part of the house on fire. Moreover, on January 31st, just 1 week after the arrest, a mass procession took place through the streets of Bolivia, from the criminal's house to the courthouse, led by women expressing their resistance to male violence and corruption in the judiciary. Thousands marched, chanting that this would never have happened if he had not been released. One of the slogans they gathered around and made demands for was that there is no justice for the poor, referring to the bribes received by government officials. These demonstrations took place in several cities across the country to demand judicial reform to regulate and guarantee the enforcement of sentences. Currently, Richard Choc Flores is serving his sentence, as are his accomplices, under the watchful eyes of a people who do not forget. The America serial killer Jerome Henry, Jerry Brudos. Jerry could have grown up to be an ordinary guy if his mom had raised him, but unfortunately, his mother wanted a girl, so Jerry barely had a chance. Jerome Henry Brudos was a devoted family man who did not drink, did not smoke, and used virtually no obscenities. But there was a strange secret in his life: his love for high-heeled women's shoes. Jerome Henry Brudos was born on January 31, 1939, in Webster, South Dakota. When he was born, the country had not yet recovered from the Great Depression. Jerome's father moved with his family to Oregon in search of a better life, but unfortunately, there were not many jobs there, so the family often had to move from place to place. At some point, Brudos managed to find a job and worked tirelessly in 2 places at the same time. The boys were at home with their mother. At that time, the woman treated her sons differently. She worshipped the older Larry, but she did not like the younger Jerry. In her eyes, he was not the sweetest child. She was frustrated that her youngest son did not live up to her expectations and was not born a girl. When the boy was about 5 years old, he was already left to himself. No one was particularly involved in his upbringing. Jerry often went outside and wandered for hours through the neighborhood. One day, he came across a magical thing called high-heeled shoes. His mother wore simple shoes with flat soles, and the boy did not even suspect that there was something more graceful and sophisticated in the world. Jerry was thrilled with his find. He took the shoes out of the garbage heap and brought them home. There he tried them on his feet and started walking around the room. His mother saw him and screamed that shoes were unsuitable for boys. She took them away and tossed them demonstratively in the trash can. The woman was angry and outraged about these shoes for a long time, and the little boy could not understand what caused such a violent reaction. Jerry waited until his mother left, then took the shoes out of the bucket and hid them safely. He carried them around the house when no one was there. But it was not long before she caught him again. The mother screamed even louder, grabbed his treasure, carried it to the yard, and lit the shoes on fire. The boy watched in tears as the flames devoured his shoes. The woman constantly lectured him about not taking things out of the garbage. While the fire burned, Jerry experienced mixed feelings. On the one hand, dislike toward his mother, and on the other, a strange excitement. This terrible mixture created a very strong fetish in the boy. In 1955, when Jerry was 15 years old, a family with several teenage girls moved into the house next door. The boy came up with a new hobby, spying on his young neighbors through the window. One day, while watching washed clothes hanging on a rope in the neighboring yard, Jerry sneaked up unnoticed, hiding behind a duvet, and quietly pulled off the women's underwear. He looted washed clothes many times, and it got to the point that neighbors called the police and complained about missing underwear. Then Jerry realized why the police officers came and decided to use this to his advantage. The next day, when one of the daughters was alone in the neighbor's house, Jerry knocked on the door and pretended to be a police officer. The girl had questions about the missing underwear. Of course, she recognized her clumsy neighbor, but she was curious about what he had come up with and decided to play along. Jerry asked the girl to come to his house to talk about the theft. When the neighbor appeared on the porch, the boy was beside himself with overwhelming importance. He led the girl into his room, quickly jumped out the door, put on a mask, and returned in the form of a bandit with a knife in his hand. The teenager waved a gun and forced the frightened girl to undress completely. Then he took a camera and photographed the unclothed neighbor in different poses. Not knowing what to do next, he ran out the door after taking the mask off his face. Jerry entered his room a few moments later, as if nothing had happened, and told his neighbor, who hastily put on her dress, that a masked stranger had locked him in a barn. The girl, ashamed of being deceived, ran away and never reported the attack. It was a very exciting moment for Jerome. He felt his power in keeping his neighbor under control and kept the photos as trophies that he could look at for hours. In the spring of 1956, Jerry Brudos was 16 years old. He lured a classmate into his private car. The girl agreed, thinking it was an innocent offer and expecting no trick from the quiet young man. Jerry Brudos, whose soul was already filled with indecent fantasies, drove through the city and then to the outskirts, into a small forest. He pulled out a knife he had previously hidden and ordered the girl to undress under threat of death. The classmate did not resist, but pushed him away and jumped out of the car. She could not escape, however, as Jerry immediately caught up with her and fell on her from behind. It did not look like an attack. But after stubborn flirting, a couple driving along the street noticed young people fooling around in the grass and decided to call the police, unsure whether the girl was in danger. The officers arrived in time to arrest Jerry after they had previously received an arrest warrant. They searched his room and discovered an entire collection of stolen underwear in his hiding place, as well as several intimate photos. After finding the Polaroid photos and the ID of the neighbor, they immediately linked them to a theft in the neighborhood. But instead of going to jail, Brudos was taken to the Oregon Clinic for psychological examination and involuntary treatment. In conversations with the doctor, Jerry told his fantasies and innermost thoughts that regularly came up in him. The teenager told the doctor that he dreamed of having an underground room where he could hide kidnapped girls. He reported on his special love for women's shoes and looking at indecent photos. Even then, these were warning signs for the psychiatrist, but for some reason the doctor believed this was a teenage phase in Jerome's life, and that everything would disappear on its own as soon as the man grew up. The doctors thought the condition was not that serious, so they allowed him to attend school and then return to the clinic. After 9 months of treatment, Jerome was deemed safe for society and released. He returned to his family, graduated from school and college as an electrician, and since he did not know what to do with himself afterward, he joined the army. But he was not destined to become a soldier. Jerry was discharged from the military after a few months because of his strange obsessions. In the end, he had to return to his mother's house, which she was not particularly pleased about. The woman accepted him as a stranger and brought him into a house in the backyard. Underneath it was an outbuilding that resembled a garage. Over time, he was overwhelmed again by burglaries and the theft of lingerie and shoes. One day he noticed a woman sleeping. He approached quietly from behind and strangled her neck. The woman survived, but never knew who had attacked her. When Jerome was 23, he met 17-year-old Rafi. The young people liked each other, the girl became pregnant, and in the spring of 1992, they married. In the first years of his marriage, Jerry was incredibly happy. They moved to Portland, Oregon, and when their second child was born, Brudos's mother moved into their house to help care for the grandchildren. Rafine married at a relatively young age, so she did not immediately pay attention to some of her husband's curiosities. For example, he often forced her to take off only her high-heeled shoes and pose for photos, or he asked his wife to try on underwear he had always brought with him from somewhere. Rafine would later say that she had no idea the items were stolen. Over the years, the woman became fed up with her husband's behavior and refused to take part in his strange photo shoots. Jerry left his fantasies unfulfilled because Rafine no longer played along with him. Then the desire came over him to find new treasures. To add to his collection, he began going out and stalking women. As Brudos walked around the city one day, he noticed a pretty woman rushing to the bus stop. The man followed her and jumped on the bus with her. He followed the woman to her house and stayed outside, watching through the curtains. Jerry saw the woman eating dinner, showering, and getting ready for bed. He waited a little longer after the light in the room went out, then entered her house, crept quietly to her dresser, and began carefully opening drawers to find underwear. At some point, Jerome pulled on a box too loudly, and the woman woke up to the noise. She saw the robber and screamed loudly. He rushed at her and began to squeeze her throat. As the woman became limp, it triggered a wild desire in her attacker. He took advantage of her helplessness. Afterward, Brudos calmly took his high-heeled shoes and walked away. The woman regained consciousness and reported the attack to the police, but investigators found no evidence of who could have done this. Jerry felt a sense of impunity, and his confidence grew with each new attack.